19-year-old Diana Spencer stepped out of a car at Goldsmiths' Hall, and the camera flashes hit her so fast they looked like lightning. She was newly engaged to Prince Charles, walking into a massive room filled with powerful people who already knew exactly how to speak, stand, and exist. But the world was not looking at her engagement ring. They were staring at her dress. Everyone believes royal fashion is just about looking elegant for the cameras. You might assume it is a world of endless luxury and simple choices. The reality is far more dangerous. Clothing inside the palace is a highly controlled language, and that night, Diana was speaking a dialect she had not yet mastered. Before this specific evening, the public only knew her as a soft-spoken nursery assistant. She wore modest skirts, simple sweaters, and pale colors that blended into the background. She was universally seen as innocent, compliant, and completely safe for the monarchy. The dress she wore to Goldsmiths' Hall shattered that soft image the second she stepped onto the pavement. It was constructed of stiff black silk taffeta. It was entirely strapless, dipping dangerously low across her chest, and it clung tightly to her body. The color alone was a massive shock to the system. Inside the rigid walls of the palace, black was strictly reserved for periods of mourning and highly serious official occasions. Prince Charles had actively objected to the choice. He knew exactly how the aggressive British press would interpret the severe shift in her style. Diana listened to his warnings, understood the risk, and chose to wear the dress anyway. The origin of that black gown reveals a young woman desperately trying to find her footing in a rapidly shifting world. Designers Elizabeth and David Emanuel were young, hungry, and working with very limited fabric when Diana first visited their studio. She had initially tried on a rough sample bodice just to test the general fit. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a completely different silhouette looking back. The sharp lines framed her differently, instantly making her look older, stronger, and far more defined. The designers were aiming for a grown-up movie star presence rather than playing it safe with traditional royal softness. Because they had a limited supply of the black silk, every single cut had to count. They were forced to make the dress incredibly tight, leaving no room for excess fabric to billow or flow. It ended up being 2 full sizes too small. As Diana began to climb the grand staircase at Goldsmiths' Hall, that physical restriction became a severe problem. The tight fabric fought her, with every movement making simple steps a calculated, difficult effort. She could not glide effortlessly like the seasoned royal women around her. She had to actively fight the heavy taffeta just to keep her balance. That intense physical discomfort mirrored a much deeper, terrifying panic that was quickly taking hold inside her mind. The royal world operated on a massive web of unwritten rules that everyone else in the room already seemed to understand perfectly. Diana did not have a clue. Severe questions began to race through her head as she moved through the glittering crowd. Which hand was supposed to hold her small evening bag? How low was a proper curtsy supposed to go when greeting different ranks? Was she supposed to speak first or wait to be spoken to? Every single hesitation felt magnified under the bright lights, marking her clearly as an absolute outsider who did not belong. The crushing pressure of becoming a global symbol before she had even figured out her own adult identity became completely suffocating. Unable to bear the constant watchful eyes of the crowd any longer, she quietly slipped away from the celebration. She escaped into the ladies' room, a stark, quiet space far away from the cameras. The moment the heavy door closed behind her, she broke down and began to cry. She was terrified of the relentless media, terrified of the fast-moving engagement, and terrified of a future that demanded absolute, flawless perfection every single day. She was not alone in that quiet room for long. The door opened and Grace Kelly walked in. Grace was 26 years old when she married Prince Rainier of Monaco, leaving behind a wildly successful Oscar-winning acting career. She had built a massive life entirely on her own terms, controlling her own image and choosing her own path. Then she moved 12,000 miles away to step into a royal structure that severely limited her personal freedom. She transformed overnight from a powerful Hollywood star into a woman bound by rigid ancient protocols. Grace knew exactly what it felt like to be watched, judged, and violently reshaped by a system that did not care about your personal comfort. She had lived inside that beautiful golden cage for 25 years. When Grace looked at the crying 19-year-old girl leaning against the bathroom counter, she did not see a glamorous future queen. She saw a young woman breaking under the exact same crushing weight she had once been forced to carry. Grace did not offer polite, empty reassurances. She did not tell Diana that she would eventually get used to the strict rules or that the press would eventually back off. Instead, she stepped close and gently cupped the young woman's face in her hands. She smiled the way only a true survivor can smile. Then she delivered a single, devastating sentence. "It will only get worse," Grace told her. That was the deeply hidden truth of the palace system. The aggressive public scrutiny never fades, the impossible expectations never lower, and the cameras never truly turn off. Diana absorbed those heavy words in the quiet of the bathroom, but her sharp instincts picked up on something else hiding just beneath Grace's perfect delivery. Diana later described Grace as looking wonderful and completely serene on the outside. Yet, in that private moment, the young girl sensed what she called troubled water under her. Diana realized right then that the flawless composure Grace displayed to the entire world was a carefully crafted performance. It was hiding a deep, lingering strain that the older woman carried every single day. Grace's quiet, blunt warning was rooted in what she had already observed about Diana's fast-moving situation. The global public was completely obsessed with the fairy tale of the royal engagement, viewing it as a perfect match. Grace, however, saw an incredibly dangerous imbalance forming right in front of her. The highly publicized courtship had only lasted 7 months. Diana was barely an adult, completely untested by the brutal realities of public life. Prince Charles was 32 years old. Grace understood immediately that this massive 13-year age gap represented a severe divide in power, influence, and life experience. Charles was a fully formed man who had spent decades deeply entrenched in royal duties. He carried complex emotional history and had deeply set daily routines that could not be easily altered. Diana was still discovering her own basic identity. They had very little in common, and their fundamental views of how the world worked were completely different. When two people meet at such vastly different stages of life, finding a true emotional connection becomes incredibly difficult. Even more concerning to Grace was the invisible, lingering presence of Camilla. Rumors of Charles's deep ties to her were well known to anyone paying close attention to the royal circles. Grace knew from her own painful experiences that entering a marriage where emotional history still occupied massive space was a guaranteed recipe for severe isolation. Emotional history does not simply vanish because a new, highly publicized relationship begins. It stays firmly in the room, shaping how a person shows up in the present moment. Diana was stepping into a highly complex situation where she was not starting from zero. She was stepping onto a moving train. Despite the tears, the terror, and the stark warning, Diana eventually had to leave the safety of the bathroom. There was no escape hatch. She walked back out into the bright lights of Goldsmiths' hall, facing the exact same crowded room, the exact same heavy expectations, and the exact same flashing cameras. The tight black silk dress still restricted her breath. the unwritten royal rules were still confusing and dangerous. But she did not run out the front door. She stayed, physically stepping into a reality that would ultimately consume her entire private life. Grace also returned to the glittering party. She blended seamlessly back into her highly polished role, projecting the effortless, untouchable elegance the global public demanded of her. The two women drifted back into their separate, highly controlled royal orbits, but a profound, silent understanding had permanently passed between them behind that closed door. The distance between deep experience and complete innocence had vanished for just a few minutes. Their paths slowly diverged in how they chose to handle the crushing daily pressure of their famous titles. Grace largely absorbed the heavy demands of Monaco. She followed the strict rules and maintained the pristine image of a perfect princess until the very end. There were credible reports that she had once deeply considered returning to acting. She had even circled a specific film project that almost brought her back to the silver screen. But the massive pressure of the crown quickly closed in around her, and the idea was quietly abandoned. She raised her children and fulfilled her endless official duties, though reports often whispered of her deep isolation. Her husband's rumored relationships created a vast emotional distance that she had to navigate entirely in secret. She had traded one vibrant world for a highly structured one, and a deeply personal piece of her slipped away in the transaction. Diana, however, eventually chose a completely different route to survive her own golden cage. After her grand, televised wedding in July 1981, the severe cracks in her marriage became impossible to hide from the public. Charles's deep connection to Camilla did not fade away as expected. Instead of suffering entirely in silence and absorbing the pain like Grace had done, Diana slowly began to push back. She found specific charitable causes that deeply mattered to her. She began visiting highly stigmatized hospitals, taking off her gloves and touching sick people directly. Other royals maintained a strict, sterile physical distance from the public. Diana broke that ancient rule. She carved out a highly emotional, deeply human voice that the public responded to with massive, overwhelming affection. She refused to remain a quiet, compliant symbol. Just 18 months after their private meeting in the Goldsmiths' Hall bathroom, a sudden tragedy unexpectedly linked the two women again. On September 14, 1982, Grace Kelly died violently at the age of 52. Her car crashed off a steep, winding road along the rocky cliffs of Monaco. The entire world was completely shocked by the sudden, brutal loss of a woman whose life had always seemed so perfectly controlled and deeply protected. A massive funeral was quickly arranged at St. Nicholas Cathedral, drawing heads of state and celebrities from across the globe. Diana was pregnant with her first child at the time. She was still very new to her high-pressure royal role, constantly navigating the intense vulnerability of expecting a baby while being hunted by aggressive photographers. Prince Charles expressed deep concern about her traveling to attend the funeral. He worried heavily about her highly sensitive nature. He feared that the massive emotional weight of a globally televised funeral, combined with her pregnancy, would simply be too much for her to physically and mentally handle. The palace could have easily sent an older, much more seasoned royal representative to simply show their polite respects. Diana absolutely refused to stay home. She insisted on going to Monaco. She explained her firm reasoning to Charles with a piercing, highly personal observation. She told her husband that Grace had been an outsider who married into a big family and that she felt exactly the same way. This was not a trip born of strict royal duty or forced obligation. It was an act of profound, deep personal recognition. She boarded the plane to Monaco completely alone. It marked her very first solo overseas royal duty, stepping out onto the massive global stage without her husband standing beside her to absorb the attention. She arrived at the cathedral just before the heavy service began. She showed absolutely no desire to socialize with the other dignitaries or be seen by the press any longer than strictly necessary. She simply walked into the massive stone building to honor a woman who had seen her clearly when she was absolutely terrified and completely alone. Standing among ordinary citizens, famous public figures, and grieving European royalty, Diana carried the heavy weight of the moment entirely on her own shoulders. She deeply understood the severe, hidden cost of the highly restricted life Grace had lived, because it was the exact same life she was currently enduring in London. Showing up was her quiet way of acknowledging the shared pain of the golden cage. The haunting similarities between their two highly publicized stories would eventually end in a terrifyingly identical fashion. Years after officially separating from Charles, Diana attempted to build a totally new life outside the immediate, suffocating shadow of the British crown. She was constantly hunted by photographers wherever she traveled. While moving quickly through Paris on August 31st, 1997, fleeing the relentless cameras that had obsessively tracked her every move since she was 19 years old, her car violently crashed inside a dark tunnel. She died at the terribly young age of 36. The eerie parallels between the two iconic women are impossible to ignore. Both women had previously spoken to friends about a deep-seated, lingering fear of cars and fatal accidents. Both women had entered powerful royal families rapidly, swept up in fast-moving romances with significantly older men who already held immense power. Both women willingly traded their personal freedom for a famous title that demanded constant, flawless public performance. Both women discovered that the fairy tale sold to the public was actually a highly restrictive system designed to erase their individuality. Grace Kelly adapted to the crushing pressure, maintaining her elegant, silent composure until the cliffs of Monaco claimed her life. Princess Diana fought against the pressure, exposing the deep flaws of the royal system until a concrete pillar in Paris ended hers. Next time you look at a glossy photograph of a perfect royal wave or a beautiful flowing gown, look closer at the tension in their shoulders. Remember the 19-year-old girl crying alone in a bathroom, suddenly realizing her life was no longer her own. One woman warned her about the trap, one woman survived it for a short time, and neither of them ever truly escaped.